Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. Canada's ongoing wildfire season is once again claiming lives, forcing evacuations, and ravaging entire communities, particularly First Nations northern communities. Climate change, caused by the burning of fossil fuels, is making extreme wildfires more common in Canada. But my guest today says that CBC, our public broadcaster, is often failing to report on the bigger picture of climate change to its audiences. Tara Mahoney has spent a lot of time in recent years tracking CBC's climate change coverage, and she sees plenty of gaps. Mahoney is the Research and Engagement Coordinator and Postdoctoral Fellow at Simon Fraser University's Community Engaged Research Initiative. Thanks for joining us today, Tara.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're happy to have you. And just a reminder to our audiences as we get started to please like and subscribe if you want more bold journalism for transformation. Now, Tara, in 2023, you published, along with a team of researchers, the Quiet Alarm Report, analyzing 2 weeks of CBC News coverage on climate change. Before we talk about what you found in your research, what prompted you to do it in the first place?
I had just given birth to my second child. She was born June 28th, 2021, which still is the hottest day on record in BC. That was when we had the devastating heat dome that covered Vancouver for a few days. And so she was born on that day, and it was, obviously very concerning to be giving birth to somebody on the hottest day on record. And then, of course, that turned into a season of wildfires in BC, and so the smoke made it so that I wasn't able to bring her outside very much in her first few months of life, and just a deeply unsettling time. And so as I was experiencing this, I was watching the news as one does, and just noticing that they would report on the heat dome and the fires, but almost never make the connection to climate change. And then it was literally, they would never mention the connection to the burning of fossil fuels that was causing climate change. We know that it's irrefutable now that the burning of fossil fuels causes climate change. And the fact that that wasn't being reported in all of this climate news that I was seeing on the CBC and other outlets was just shocking to me. So I wanted to do something about it while I was on mat leave, and I reached out to some colleagues, some academic colleagues who were also concerned about this, and we hatched together a plan to design a community engaged research project. So our research, our data was actually gathered by people across the country, CBC audience members who watched flagship shows over 2 weeks, and would fill out a survey after every show to let us know, was there an extreme weather event that was covered, or another climate story? Was climate change mentioned as the cause of extreme weather, or at least link the two? And was fossil fuels mentioned as the cause of climate change? We also had other questions around climate solutions and sources, and that, like, who is considered an authoritative source in a climate story, other questions which are detailed in the report. But yeah, so that's kind of what led to it, was this sort of like devastating personal moment of my child being born in a heat dome, which then led to the drive to do something about it and collaborate with my community, and then eventually led to the Quiet Alarm Report.
I appreciate you sharing that. Your research gives CBC credit for some of its climate coverage, but it also identifies some major gaps and shortfalls. Can you tell us about some of the report's major critiques?
Sure. Yeah. So I do want to emphasize, that CBC is doing good climate journalism. I don't just want to skip past that, because they're in some places, their climate dashboard, the What on Earth podcast, some investigative pieces that they've done have been excellent, and I think they deserve credit for that. And, there's a climate section on their website, and they are trying to respond to this phenomenon of climate change and trying to cover it well in some cases. But what we some of the major kind of like findings that some of the gaps that we found in our research was that the climate news was sporadic, inconsistent, and often absent from daily programming. So it's not that, if you're someone like me who's interested in climate and you go and find it on the website and you're subscribed to the podcasts and the different journalists that report on this, I'm getting decent information, right? But for the average news consumer, the person who watches the National, the person who listens to the radio show on their way to work, that's what our concern, that's where our concern lied, because that's where the attribution was not happening, that's where the attribution of extreme weather to climate change and to fossil fuels was not happening in those daily reports. And I mean, there was other things around, solutions, and the idea that there could be more solutions orientated reporting, the idea that politicians often are the center of a climate story, but they're among the least trusted. So thinking about other sources, like who are the other sources in climate stories you could be talking to? There was, 7 different sort of findings that we came to. And I just want to say, with the two main ones around the sporadic and inconsistent reporting, and then the lack of connection between extreme weather, climate change, and the burning of fossil fuels. Some of this is an easy fix, like, Covering Climate Now, which is a consortium of media organizations around the world that have committed to certain standards when it comes to climate journalism, offer some good, best practices or protocols around this stuff, like just putting fossil fuel induced climate change, for example, in an article or in a podcast. It doesn't cost anything to do that. It clarifies for the audience what the cause of this is. It reminds people that, climate change is not like an act of God that we can't stop. We have the solutions. We know what to do. We know we need to reduce fossil fuel consumption. And this is just like reinforcing that idea by helping the audience make this connection. And the other idea that we put forward as a potential remedy is the idea of a daily climate report. So, if you listen to the radio, the morning radio show on CBC in whatever city you're living in, you get the business news every hour on the hour. You get the sports news every hour on the hour. Why aren't we getting the climate news every hour on the hour? Especially when there's so much happening in climate. Like, not only do we need to know about what is the air quality outside my door if I'm going to walk my kids to school, I want to know that. What is the latest, what is my municipal, provincial, federal government? Where are they on climate policy? I don't know. Like, what's the rundown of where we are? Where are we in relation to the Paris targets? What's happening globally with climate? Like, I see these images on social media of like, it's flooding in Italy, or it's, there's a drought in Egypt, or, but I need a sense of like, where are we at with what's going on? So we were really advocating for this daily, hourly update on climate news that could be incorporated into the CBC's programming.
And why the focus on the CBC rather than another, big private corporate broadcaster or a set of corporate broadcasters?
We actually followed up this report with a second report that focused on climate reporting during the BC election, where we did look at the private broadcasters. And the results were very similar. CBC was actually doing a bit better than the private broadcasters. But the reason why we wanted to focus on the CBC was because it's the public broadcaster, right? They're paid for by tax dollars. The budget for the CBC this year is $1.38 billion. So I support public broadcasting. Don't get me wrong. I think public broadcasting is essential, especially in this age of mis and disinformation. We absolutely need the CBC. I'm not saying we don't need it. I'm saying we need it to give us what we need, which is better climate news. And so we wanted to focus on the public broadcaster because as the taxpayers who are supporting the CBC, we should have a say in what we want from our public broadcaster. And we're not asking for much. Like, we're just asking for help us understand this incredibly complex issue on a daily basis? How does it work into my day-to-day life? What considerations do I need to have around this issue? You take something like insurance, for example. The insurance industry is under like a tremendous transformation because of climate impacts. That is the direct impact. If you live close to like a floodplain, or if you live close to a big forest that's at risk of forest fires, your insurance premiums are either changing or will change very soon. And that's an example of an economic climate story that like should be in top of people's minds, right? Because that's going to influence where they move, where they live, what considerations they might have for where they'll travel to or where their family might move to. And so our news should be keeping us up to date on that stuff. So yeah, I think the private broadcaster has a specific role to play, a specific responsibility, because they are publicly funded to not only listen to what their audience members are asking for, but also to deliver the news in a factual way, tell the whole story, which again, coming back to linking, at the very least, linking extreme weather events to the burning of fossil fuels.
My wonderful colleague here at the Breach, Amanda Sino, reviewed some CBC news stories during the height of the wildfire coverage that we've just been experiencing in the last week and a bit. So, we know that your reporting and your research covers pieces of the last couple of years. But when we look at what we've just been living through, we took a look at some news stories from CBC along the same lines, looking for mentions of climate change and related terms. Our review wasn't nearly as rigorous, of course, as your reporting was, but we did find that out of 59 news stories that we reviewed, only 7 of them mentioned climate change, global warming, or fossil fuels. And most of those mentions were actually by people that the CBC was interviewing rather
Mm-hmm.
than by the reporters themselves who were creating the story.
Mm-hmm.
Tara, I know you've also been monitoring the CBC coverage recently during these recent wildfires. What's your impression of how CBC is doing years on from your initial research?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty discouraging, I gotta say. It doesn't seem like there's been much improvement, which is why I wrote the open letter I did, calling on the CBC to reread our report or read our report for the first time, because it's just staggering. Like it's just so frustrating to have worked on this project when we were writing our report and doing the research. We were in active conversations with the CBC in the sense of like we were letting them know we were doing this research, we were sending them the report when it was done, we were following up. So it's not that, and we were hearing from folks that like the report was getting circulated and stuff like that. So it's not that they haven't seen it, and it's not as if I don't they get this criticism from I think a lot of different corners. So it's not as if they don't know. And So then you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why is this happening? Why are, smart producers and decision makers at the CBC choosing not to make these attributions to the burning of fossil fuels? Well, and all of the other recommendations that we had, but let's just focus on that one because I think that's the most obvious and egregious. Um, I mean, I think there's like a few different reasons that, we could look at like journalistic conventions around attribution. There's been even though there's overwhelming global scientific consensus on the cause of climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. I think people might be cautious around, attributing it for whatever reason directly, attributing one weather event to climate change. Although, you don't need to make that direct. People often say extreme weather events are made more extreme by climate change, which is caused by fossil fuels. So there's ways to nuance your language to avoid that. There's also this desire to avoid appearing like advocacy orientated, where this misunderstanding, in my opinion, that context means that you're taking a position, which is not the case. Unfortunately, climate change has been politicized in our political discourse, where if you're liberal, you believe in climate change. If you're conservative, you are skeptical of it, which is, very unfortunate and is the result of a lot of, 30 years of propaganda from the fossil fuel industry fueling that intentionally. And so you get this fear, I think, among journalists, where they don't want to attribute the cause because they think, well, then that means that I'm like taking a side on climate change. But that's ridiculous, because it's the scientific fact, like it's a fact that the burning of fossil fuels causes climate change. So saying that fact in a story is not taking a side. And if someone suggests that it is, that person is completely out to lunch. Like, they don't understand how this works, And the other thing is that physics doesn't care about this, like, we're just going to keep. Bill McKibben recently made this point, the environmentalist. The climate does not care whether we think that it's left or right or conservative or not. It's just going to keep happening, whether we'd like it or not. So if you are a fact-based journalist organization, then you should be reporting on those facts. And if you're leaving out the key reason why something is happening, in my opinion, that's journalism malpractice, and it needs to be called out.
I want to pick up on that actually, because I've also worked in mainstream news environments, and I know that very often there's much more of a focus on what's happening rather than why something is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an argument for a news outlet reporting on, say, emergency wildfire evacuations like we've been seeing in the past week? It's an emergency situation. People are running for their lives. Is it fair for a media outlet to simply focus on those more immediate details of the situation?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think they should foreground the immediate details. That's what people want to know, right? They want to know, where is, in the case of a wildfire, where is the wildfire happening? What is the evacuation status of that fire? How big is it? So I'm not saying, so you can still include all of that, and you can still attribute it to the cause. You can still explain to people why. And like the point I made earlier, that doesn't require a big long explanation. That just requires a few phrases. Ideally, there's a little bit more fleshed out, but it in some cases it's a few phrases. It's just making that attribution over and over again, because there's been other research done by Reclimate and another organization we cite in our report, that says that there is a climate literacy problem in Canada as well, where almost half of the population has trouble attributing climate change to the burning of fossil fuels, and is confused about. I just read something that Reclimate published, I think it was last week or the week before, saying that it's around 40 some percent of people aren't sure whether climate change is a hoax or not. So, we have a really big climate literacy problem. So when you combine that climate literacy problem with the fact that the CBC in this case is not attributing the cause to the extreme weather, it's no wonder people are confused, right? There's a information vacuum, because people aren't being told the cause of climate change, unless they go and seek it out in specific, stories or journalists or whatever.
If I can just jump
Yeah.
in about that, because there's some very new polling that just came out
Mm-hmm.
this week by Angus Reid. And I'm just going to read a little excerpt from it. They found that about 59% of those polled describe climate change as a fact that is mostly caused by humans. 59%. And that number is a 15-year low and down 4 percentage points compared to last year. The pollster, Shachi Kurl, who did that polling, also said that it's not just that people are more skeptical. They also feel less pressure right now to find solutions to climate change, to your point about the urgency of this moment.
Yeah, it sucks, it's sad, but it doesn't surprise me in a way. Basically, Amy Westervelt has this term that combines like petro-state and propaganda, petro-propaganda, where she talks about how fossil fuel interests shape the entire information ecosystem and have for, it's well documented that the fossil fuel industry has been on a disinformation campaign since the 70s when they learned about the connection between burning fossil fuels and climate change. And so it's no surprise, and there's ebbs and flows, sometimes when the climate movement gets more energy behind it, then public opinion shifts, and then we're currently in a retreat, right now. So then these opinions can crop up again. But I think it's this information ecosystem that the fossil fuel industry has created that includes, university research, think tanks, consulting reports, sponsored journalism, advertising, lobbying, influencer campaigns, disinformation campaigns, school materials, even their own public opinion polling. So there's an ecosystem here of propaganda that's at play that I think we really need to pay attention to. And it's been around for so long, and it's so sophisticated that it's hard to detect. It feels like it's just what people think, but it's actually not. It's actually been constructed by the industry. So I think that has a role to play in these public opinion polls. And just to bring it into the present moment, I think, when President Trump, like, let's not underestimate his influence, right? When he goes and says, well, last year he said climate change is a scam or a hoax or whatever he said. And then just, last week he's saying, getting mad at Canada for the forest fire smoke going across the border and saying we need to clean up our forests, and attributing the cause of the fires to forest management, which is so ridiculous. Like, it's a factor in the issue, of course. If there's fuels to burn in a fire and they haven't been cleaned up in a long time, fine, yeah, it makes it worse, but it's not the cause of the context. It's not that poor forest management is not creating a heat dome. um, and is not creating, drought and instability. And so, but he says something like that, and people go, "Oh yeah, that sounds true," and it's very convenient to then believe that, right? Because it's really difficult to accept that climate change is real, and that it's happening, and that it's scary, and it's big, and it's much easier to just believe that it's poor fire management. So it doesn't surprise me in a way that, there's this regression on climate understanding, because the fossil fuel propaganda is so strong. And because we have someone like Donald Trump in the president's office, who, I mean, that's the loudest megaphone you can have, right? Is the one he's got. And he's a climate denier. And he told the fossil fuel industry, give me $1 billion and you can have whatever you want. So of course he's going to say ridiculous things like that, but it has influence,
Speaking of political influence, I wonder how much of this broader conversation you contribute to a political climate in Canada specifically, where politicians just will not mention climate change or greenhouse gas emissions unless they're explicitly asked about it by reporters. How much is that reluctance by our political leaders to talk about this influencing how it's being covered?
I think it's having a huge effect, and it's extremely disappointing that our leaders will not mention explicitly climate change in their. They should be talking about it every single day, in my opinion, because we're living it every single day. People are experiencing it every single day. And they're not talking about it. I mean, I think they're not talking about it for like pretty obvious reasons. Like, it's a difficult topic. It requires like transformation in our economic and political decision making, and that's extremely hard to do as a politician. And I mean, I think that's the main reason, but there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't want to mention it. I think when politicians do speak up on climate, especially female politicians, as we've seen, they get a ton of hate and, violent communication sent to them. So there's a cost in talking about it. So yeah, I mean, it's too bad. I'm glad that there are some politicians out there that do talk about it explicitly, but I think that makes the role of journalism even more important, to be pushing this question. So in our second follow-up report to Quiet Alarm, when we looked at the climate reporting during the BC provincial election, just this past election we had a few years ago, we looked at, this question, that we called it the climate question. And it was a bit disappointing to see that like journalists it wasn't even on the radar. And ironically, on election day, there was a atmospheric river passing through BC that resulted in the deaths of two people because their home slid into the river, which was a climate disaster, and I listened to several interviews with David Eby, some of them 10, 12 minutes long.
David
And he,
Eby being he was running for re-election as premier at that time.
yes, yes. And so he was running for premier, and the journalists talked to him for, 10, 12 minutes. There wasn't a question about climate change. So yes, the politicians have a responsibility to do it. We know they're probably not going to, because it's a difficult issue that's going to cost them to mention, to tell the truth on climate. And so then I think the onus then goes back on journalists, and in this case, our public broadcaster, to ask the climate question.
You mentioned having conversations with people at CBC, and I know you talk to reporters in general. Have reporters ever explained to you why they fail in general to ask more questions about climate change?
I talked to quite a few freelance reporters and some former CBC employees, and also some employees at other private news organizations. And the things I heard were that often they pitch climate stories and they don't get approved. Like they'll pitch, kind of what I'm advocating for, making the connection between extreme weather, climate change, and the burning of fossil fuels, and then talking about the political and economic choices that are related to that. Those often get shot down, those stories. I think they're told that the audience isn't interested in climate news, so it's not getting the attention that the news organization is looking for. Um, I've heard people say that they've been told that um, climate stories, they don't want to be seen as advocacy supporting. We talked about this already, but they'll say we need to be neutral on this issue, or so we're not gonna. But again, we've already made this point, but talking about the context and about the facts and about the cause of climate change is not advocacy. It's just reporting the facts. So yeah, there's been a few different reasons why I think reporters aren't covering it as much as maybe they should be.
I want to play a clip now of veteran Canadian journalist Chantal Hébert, who is a regular on CBC's At Issue panel. This clip is not from CBC. It's actually from Peter Mansbridge's most recent Good Talk podcast, where they were talking about climate change and the wildfires. And Chantal's response here is a response to a question about the worsening state of wildfires in Canada. Let's have a listen.
Oh, well, someone forgot to tell the climate gods that we were busy dealing with other stuff, and so the climate crisis should be put on hold. That is the reality, that while priorities have shifted for short-term political reasons, the climate issue, and I don't just mean Canada here, I mean globally, the climate issue is still there, and it's not going to wait for us to get our attention back on it and to reduce emissions.
So I've heard Chantal Hébert make this similar analysis that the climate crisis is not going to wait for us and that we do need to reduce emissions. I've heard her make this claim on CBC as well. And I wonder, Tara, is there a case that a commentary space like CBC's At Issue panel, where Hébert is a recurring guest, is the more appropriate place to get into the why of climate change versus, say, day-to-day news coverage?
I think it's both. It has to be both. So, to the point I made earlier, I think we need a climate a daily climate report in all newscasts in the same way we have a business report and a sports report. We need to be attributing the burning of fossil fuels to climate change and extreme weather anytime it comes up. So anytime there's an extreme weather story, though climate change and fossil fuels need to be mentioned. So I think that is essential to me for public understanding of this issue. And yes, commentary, of course. Like, this is the thing about shying away from climate that I don't understand, is that there are so many rigorous debates to be had about what do we do about this, like how do we build a renewable economy? How do we transition off fossil fuels? What do we do about, transportation and jobs and, all of these issues that are wrapped up in the climate and health? What does it mean for healthcare? And so we need to talk about those things as a country often, and God bless Chantal Hébert for bringing it to the national every Thursday. But I mean, we need a lot more of that. And we need people who, on that at issue panel. I mean, I watch it every Thursday. I think it's good. All due respect to those three folks on there, but like, we need some other perspectives there, like some people who understand the climate issue very well to come in and start having an exchange of ideas that moves the discourse forward, right? Elevates the discourse beyond, where we're at now, which is still a very basic back and forth about, do we build pipelines or not? Like there's still so much more to talk about than that. And so I absolutely think commentary is a great place to have those conversations, and we need to be having them in the daily news as well.
Finally, Tara, you brought up before the letter that you wrote to CBC leadership about their recent coverage. You singled out some programming on the National for CBC and saying that there just weren't enough connections being made to the causes of climate change. I want to read a little excerpt from that letter and ask you a question about it. You said, I'm quoting now, "Context is not advocacy. It is fundamental journalism. Reporting on wildfire destruction without consistently explaining the role of human-caused climate change and fossil fuel emissions leaves audiences with an incomplete understanding of one of the defining issues of our time." So, that idea that you've repeated in this interview, that context isn't advocacy, I want to ask you, given the reality of climate change and the existential threat that it poses to humanity, doesn't the public broadcaster have a responsibility to advocate for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions?
I believe they do. I mean, news and journalism is not value neutral, right? Like, we're human beings. We want to live. We want to continue to be healthy. We want to presumably live in a democracy. These values are present in our society, I would say. There's some basic things I think we've agreed to around life and health and democracy and fairness. And so I think that on this issue, I think they do have a responsibility to report what the facts are, and also deliver the news in a way that we can make informed decisions around this issue with the urgency that it requires, right? Like, there is no other issue like climate change. It intersects with every other issue, and it's on a ticking clock, right? We needed to act in a big way, like yesterday, and so our public broadcaster, I would argue, all broadcasters, all people in communication, this I think needs to be front and center, because it's urgent. It intersects with so many other issues. And if we care about life, then we have a responsibility to protect it and try and at least slow down some of the impacts that are happening. And so I think it's an opportunity to reflect on the values of CBC, right? I mean, all news organizations, but we're talking about the CBC. So what are their values related to life on Earth? Do they feel a responsibility to defend life on Earth? At the very least, inform human beings about what's happening to life on Earth. And how we might, change course. So these are like very fundamental values questions that I think this is an opportunity to reflect on.
Well, we appreciate the chance to reflect on them with you as we see the dire consequences and communities being evacuated, communities being burned down. It's a really important time to be having this conversation, and we're so glad that you joined us today to take part. So thank you very much for being with us, Tara.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.